The first scream tore through the east wing at 11:40 at night, and I was already moving before the second one hit, because Poppy was strapped against my chest and there was nowhere else to put her. 4 nannies had quit Harrow House since spring. The agency told me that on the drive up, like a warning, like I was supposed to turn the car around. I didn't turn the car around. I had $11 and a baby who needed formula by Thursday, and the woman who ran this house was paying double for anyone willing to walk into a nursery that ate people alive. Edna Doyle met me at the servant's door with a lantern and a face like a shut window. "You can't bring that in here," she said, looking at Poppy's small dark head where it rested under my chin. "Mistress Vantison doesn't allow children on the grounds who aren't hers. She's 13 months old. She sleeps through anything." That wasn't true. Nothing in this world slept through the sound coming from upstairs. A raw, tearing wail that had been going for what I would later learn was the 11th consecutive night. "That's Master Milo," Edna said, and something in her voice cracked open just slightly, enough that I saw the exhaustion under the disapproval. 10 months old, and he has not slept 4 hours together since the day he was born. 3 physicians, 2 specialists from the city, a woman who claimed to read auras. Nothing. She looked at me the way you look at a stray dog you already know you're going to feed. "Stay in the kitchen wing. Do not go upstairs. Do not let that child cry where anyone can hear it." I stayed in the kitchen wing for 1 hour and 11 minutes before the wail overhead changed pitch, and every part of me that used to wear a nurse's badge sat up straight. It wasn't colic anymore. Colic had a rhythm, a rise and fall you could set a clock by. This was different, short, clipped, breath held too long between cries. I had heard it exactly twice before in my life, both times in a NICU that no longer let me through its doors, both times attached to a baby in real pain. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for exactly as long as it took Poppy to squirm against the carrier straps, twist her whole small body toward the sound like a compass needle finding north, and start reaching. The staircase to the east wing was dark oak, cold under my palm, and it went up faster than I meant it to. I found the nursery door already open. Inside, a woman stood in the lamplight with a shrieking infant pressed to her shoulder, rocking him with the mechanical, hopeless motion of someone who has done this every night for 10 months and stopped believing it works. She was tall in a way that made the room feel smaller, dressed like she'd come straight from a boardroom and never left. Dark hair pulled back so hard it looked like it hurt. I knew her face before I knew her name, the way everyone in 3 counties knew it. The widow of Harrow Point, who had buried a wife and built a shipping empire in the same 18 months and was rumored not to have cried once through either. She looked up. Her eyes went to me, then down to Poppy, then back to me with something sharper than anger. "Who let you up here?" "No one," I said. "I let myself." The baby in her arms screamed again, a sound with a jagged edge to it that made my own daughter go rigid against my chest. "Then let yourself back down," the woman said, and her voice didn't rise, which was somehow worse than if it had. "This isn't a room for staff to gawk at my son. I should have gone. I had $11 and a warning already spent." But Poppy was straining against the carrier so hard the buckle bit into my shoulder, and before I could stop her, before I could stop either of us, my daughter let out a small, furious noise of her own and lunged toward the crib rail like the crying boy belonged to her. The widow of Harrow Point looked at my baby reaching for hers, and for the first time that night, she went completely still. I hadn't planned to set Poppy down. I told myself later that it was instinct, the kind of thing a mother's arms do before her mind catches up, but the truth was simpler and less flattering. My daughter had wanted down with the single-minded fury of a 13-month-old, and I had been too tired, too far from home, too aware of the woman staring at me to argue with her. So I knelt and unbuckled the carrier, and Poppy hit the floor crawling. "Wait," the widow of Harrow Point said, and it was the first time I heard something other than command in her voice. Alarm. Maybe. Or hope trying not to be hope. Poppy didn't wait. She crossed the nursery rug on hands and knees with the single-minded purpose of a small tank, past a rocking horse, past a stack of unread parenting books with their spines still stiff, straight to the crib where the woman had just set her son down between contractions of crying and pulled herself up on the rail with both fists. The boy's scream cut off mid-breath. I have delivered that sentence 100 times since, in my head at 3 a.m, and it never gets less strange to say. He didn't quiet down. He didn't whine toward sleep the way exhausted infants sometimes do. He simply stopped, both fists in the air, and stared at the dark-haired baby, now gripping his crib rail an inch from his face, and made a small, curious sound that was almost a laugh. Poppy patted his hand. He grabbed her wrist with the fierce, clumsy grip of a baby who has found something more interesting than his own misery, and put it directly in his mouth, and the nursery went so quiet I could hear the clock on the mantel for the first time since I'd come up the stairs. The widow of Harrow Point, Calavantison, though I would not learn her given name for 3 more days, sat down very slowly on the ottoman by the crib, as though her legs had simply stopped being reliable. "He hasn't stopped like that," she said, to no one, to the room, in 10 months. "Sometimes it's not about being soothed," I said, before I could stop myself. "Old habits, old training, from a life I wasn't supposed to still be carrying around in my mouth. Sometimes it's about not being the only one anymore." She looked up at me, and I understood, in the space of that look, exactly how much a person can want something without being able to ask for it. "Who are you?" she said. Not a demand this time, almost a question. "Wren Calloway. Agency sent me for laundry and floors." I gestured at the 2 babies, Milo's whole fist still lodged in Poppy's small, determined grip. "I don't think either of us signed up for this part." "What do you know about infant distress?" She said it like an accusation, like she needed it to be an accusation, because the alternative was hope, and hope had clearly cost her before. "I used to be a nurse," I said. "Pediatric. Before. Before what?" I didn't answer that. Not yet. Some doors you don't open for a woman you've known for 6 minutes, no matter how tired her eyes are. She studied me a long moment, the scent of her cutting through the milk-warm nursery air, juniper, and something colder underneath it, like gunmetal left out in winter rain. It should have felt like a threat. It didn't entirely. And underneath my own arm, where Poppy had left a small warm space, I caught the ghost of my own signature drifting back at her, brown sugar gone soft with worry, warm chamomile, after a long day. I watched something in her face catch on it, the way a person catches on a smell that reminds them of a kitchen they haven't stood in for years. "His formula log is on the counter," she said finally, nodding toward the changing table, her voice gone flat and careful, a woman rebuilding a wall in real time. "If you know something about infant distress, Miss Calloway, you have 5 minutes to prove it before I call the agency and have you both escorted off my property." I picked up the log. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking, for the first time in 10 months of shaking hands, because for the first time in a long while I was being asked to be the thing I used to be instead of the thing I'd been reduced to. 5 minutes, I said. I'll need 6. Something that was almost a laugh moved behind her eyes and did not reach her mouth. "You have 5. I found what I was looking for in 4. By the second week, I had stopped sleeping in the maid's quarters over the garages and started sleeping in the small adjoining room off the east nursery, close enough to hear if either baby stirred, which they did constantly, together, in a way that made Edna Doyle mutter about omens and cross herself twice a shift. The formula log had shown me a pattern, a supplement added 11 weeks ago, right around the time the crying had turned from ordinary infant misery into something sharper, something with an edge that didn't fit any textbook colic I'd ever charted. I hadn't said all of that to Kalavantasen on the first night. I'd said enough. Enough that by morning she had moved us into the East Wing herself over Edna's protests, with 4 words that I turned over in my head for days afterward. "I don't discard help," she'd said, standing in the doorway of what used to be a guest suite, watching 2 men from the household carry in what little Poppy and I owned. Not when it works. It should have stung, being called help that worked, like a tool proving its edge. It didn't, because of how she'd said it, not cold, exactly, just careful, the way you handle something you're afraid to want too openly. The house itself was a lesson I hadn't asked for. My old apartment could have fit inside the East Wing's private sitting room twice over, with space left for a garden. The floors were the kind of pale stone that made every footstep sound like an announcement. Staff who had ignored me on the stairs for 2 weeks now watched me with the specific, assessing hostility reserved for someone who has moved up faster than the ladder allows. "Careful," said one of the upstairs maids, a beta named Junie with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, catching me in the hallway with an armful of Milo's linens. "She goes through people, nannies, nurses, whole security details. You're not special. You're just new." "I'm aware," I said, and kept walking, because I was painfully aware every hour of every day of exactly how temporary a thing like this could be for a woman like me. Kalavantasen did not make grand declarations. She made smaller ones, the kind you had to be paying attention to catch. The first week, she noticed I was skipping the staff lunch to feed Poppy first and started having a second tray sent up without a word about it. The second week, she asked, offhand, over Milo's evening bottle, what I used to eat as a child, and 2 nights later, there was a shepherd's pie on the sideboard that tasted, disorientingly, almost exactly like my mother's, made from a recipe I hadn't repeated aloud to anyone in this house. "You didn't have to do that," I told her, staring at the dish like it might vanish. "I asked the cook to guess," she said, not looking up from the report in her lap, though her jaw had the particular set of someone braced for the wrong reaction. She's very good at guessing. It was the first time I'd caught her, unmistakably, in an act of care she hadn't wanted witnessed. I filed it away with the others, the way she checked the nursery monitor at 2 a.m. Even on nights she had a plane to catch by 6, the way her hand, once, brushed mine over the crib rail reaching for the same blanket, and neither of us moved first. And the room went very warm for 3 full seconds before she cleared her throat and said something about the temperature in the room being off. It was Delphine Ashcroft who first said my name like an accusation, on the 17th day, standing in the doorway of the nursery, in a coat the color of a bruise. "And this," she said, looking at me the way you'd look at a stain on good upholstery, "must be the new one." Delphine. Kala's voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go before, flat, controlled, careful in a different way than the careful she used with me. "You didn't call ahead. I don't need to call ahead for my nephew Kala, whatever your staff turnover has done to your manners." Delphine's eyes were Iris's eyes, I would learn later, the same pale gray, worn on a harder face. She crossed to the crib, looked down at Milo with an expression that stopped short of tenderness and landed somewhere closer to inventory. "He looks thinner." "He's eating better than he has all year, is he?" Delphine's mouth curved, sweet as poisoned sugar. "I only ask because the review board will, when the petition is filed. Fitness hearings do love a specific detail like weight." She looked at me again, lingering, cataloging. Careful who you let hold him, darling, people do talk. About a woman who fills her nursery with strays. She left a card on the side table on her way out, engraved, a lawyer's name beneath her own, and the room stayed cold long after the door had shut behind her. What petition? I asked, because someone had to. Calla didn't answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice had the flat, contained sound of a door being held shut by main force. My sister-in-law believes I am unfit to raise my son alone. She has believed it since the funeral. She picked Milo up out of the crib and held him the way you hold something you are afraid a wind might take. She's not entirely wrong to worry. I don't know what I'm doing, Miss Calloway. I never have. You know enough to keep noticing, I said. That's most of it. She looked at me like she wanted to believe that, and didn't quite dare. I found the bottle 3 days after Delphine's visit, tucked behind the tin of rice cereal in the pantry off the nursery kitchen, a small brown glass dropper, hand-labeled in a cursive that wasn't the pharmacist's, promising a gentle colic remedy, herbal, safe for infants under 1. No prescribing physician's name. No lot number, just Milo's initials and a dosing schedule in handwriting I didn't recognize, folded into the feeding log where I would eventually find it, because I had started, out of old habit, checking every log twice. I sat with it a long time before I brought it to Calla, because I knew the way you know a thing in your body before your mind lets you say it, that this was not colic. And had never been colic. And once I said that out loud, there would be no going back to not knowing it. Someone has been dosing him, I said finally, setting the dropper bottle on her desk like it might detonate. For weeks, maybe longer. Calla went very still, the particular stillness of a person doing everything in their power not to break something in the room. Dosing him with what? I don't know yet. It's not marked properly, which means whoever's giving it to him doesn't want it traced. But the pattern fits, gastric distress, that clipped high crying, the weight the log's been showing that nobody could explain. I made myself say the next part slowly, because it mattered that she heard it clearly. This isn't colic, Calla. It never was. Someone has been making your son sick on purpose, and doing it well enough that 3 specialists missed it. The color left her face in a way I had not seen before, not even the night I'd met her rocking a screaming child at 11 o'clock with the particular defeat of someone who has run out of ideas. Who? She said, and it came out like a blade unsheathing. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. She looked at me across the desk, and for the first time since I'd walked into her nursery uninvited, I watched the widow of Harrow Point look less like an empire and more like a mother standing at the edge of a cliff she hadn't known was there. It happened at 2:47 in the morning, 17 days after I'd found the dropper bottle, on a night I had convinced myself, foolishly, that we finally had time. Milo's monitor woke me first, not crying, worse, a thin, wet gasping sound that had my feet on the floor before my mind had finished forming the word wrong. I hit the nursery door at the same moment Calla did, both of us in whatever we'd been sleeping in, and found him rigid in his crib, back arched, a thread of foam at the corner of his mouth. He's seizing, I said, and my hands were already moving, turning him on his side, clearing his airway, counting seconds out loud because counting was the only thing keeping the scream in my own chest from getting out. Call Dr. Renner. Tell him convulsion. Tell him possible toxin. Tell him now. Calla didn't argue with a maid giving her orders in her own nursery. She had the phone in her hand before I'd finished the sentence, her voice a controlled shout down the line, and underneath the command I heard, for the first time, real fear, the kind that doesn't perform for anyone. The seizure lasted 41 seconds. I know because I counted every one of them with my hand on Milo's small chest, willing it to keep rising and falling. And somewhere around 30, I became aware that Kala had knelt beside me on the nursery floor and taken my free hand in both of hers, not for herself, or not only for herself, gripping it like ballast. Dr. Renner arrived at 3:20. By 4:00, Milo was stable, sedated lightly, hooked to a small monitor that beeped in steady, boring, blessed rhythm, and the three of us sat in the wreckage of the night in various states of undress and terror. "He'll live," Renner said, packing his bag with hands that weren't quite steady either. "But Miss Calloway is right. That was not colic, and it was not a fever. I'll need blood sent to the city lab. Someone gave that child something." He left, the nursery emptied of everyone but us and the sleeping, monitored boy, and the house went very quiet. The particular quiet that comes after a scream has finally stopped. "You knew," Kala said, staring at her son's small chest rising and falling. "Before any of this. You knew what to look for. I used to work nights in a unit for babies who couldn't tell anyone what was wrong with them," I said. "You learned to watch for the thing underneath the thing. Why aren't you still there?" I hadn't meant to answer that tonight. Grief has a way of picking its own hour, though, and 4 a.m. In a nursery that had just nearly lost a child seemed as honest an hour as any. "Because I got pregnant unmated," I said, "and the hospital decided a scandal was worse for its reputation than a good nurse was good for its patients. They didn't fire me outright. They just made sure no shift I asked for existed anymore, until I stopped asking." I looked down at my own hands, still faintly trembling now that the emergency had room to leave them. My family said the same thing, in different words. My pack didn't want an Omega who couldn't explain her own daughter's father, so I left before they could finish deciding whether to make me. Kala was quiet a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had none of its usual armor in it. "I was in Geneva," she said, "the night Iris went into labor early. There was a storm. The roads out of the airstrip were closed for 6 hours. By the time I landed, she was already gone, and Milo was 3 weeks premature and screaming, and I have never once, since that night, believed I got there in time for anything that mattered." Her hand tightened, briefly, around mine, still holding it, though the crisis had passed 10 minutes ago. "I built a company out of getting places on time. I have never forgiven myself for the one time it counted, and I didn't. You're here now," I said. Am I enough, though? That's the question Delphine's lawyers are going to ask a judge, and some nights I don't know how I'd answer it myself. I turned my hand in hers so our palms met properly, and said the truest thing I had, in the flattest, least dramatic voice I could manage, because some truths lose their weight if you dress them up. "Even the quietest cry gets heard eventually," I said. "You heard him tonight before the monitor did. I watched you. That's not nothing, Kala. That might be everything." She looked at me then, in the gray coming dawn light of a nursery that smelled of antiseptic and juniper and warm chamomile, like a woman standing at a door she had bricked shut 10 months ago and was only now remembering how to open. "Ren," she said, my name in her mouth for the first time since she'd learned it, and didn't say anything else, because some doors open slowly, on purpose, so the person on the other side has time to decide whether to step through. The blood work came back 4 days later, clean enough of anything acute to let Milo come home from Renner's private clinic, murky enough about the gentle colic remedy, a compound called wormwood glycoside, in a dose that had no business anywhere near an infant, that Kala stopped sleeping in her own bed and started falling asleep, most nights, in the armchair by Milo's crib. With Poppy's playpen pushed close enough that both children could reach through the rails and hold hands, which they had taken, somehow, to doing. Those were the good weeks. I think of them still as a held breath the world let us have before the next blow landed. We talked, those weeks, the way people talk when the worst thing has already tried to happen and failed. Calla told me about Iris in pieces, how she used to hum an old fisherman's ballad off-key while she cooked, how she'd wanted 3 children and Calla, terrified of her own capacity for love, had asked to wait, and then there had only ever been the one chance. She told me about the mobile above Milo's crib, hand-carved wooden stars Iris had been finishing the week she died, one star still unstrung, a raw notch in the wood where it should have hung. "I can't finish it," Calla said, looking up at the gap in the little wooden constellation. "I've tried twice. My hands won't do it." "Some things aren't meant to be finished alone," I said, and did not offer, that night, to try, because I understood by then that the mobile wasn't really about wood. I told her things too, in return, the way you trade scars once you've decided someone is safe enough to see them. I told her about the lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, before she died, called The Fisherman's Daughter. The same tune, it turned out, Iris had hummed off-key in a kitchen 3 counties away, a coincidence that made Calla go very quiet, and then, unexpectedly, laugh. Low and real, the first full laugh I'd heard out of her. I told her I used to dream, back when I still had a nurse's badge, of opening a small clinic of my own someday, for babies who cried and nobody could explain why, the ones who fell through every gap in every system, built for easier cases. I hadn't said that dream out loud to another living soul in 3 years. "You'd be good at that," Calla said, and there was something in the way she said it, quiet and certain, that I turned over in my hands for days afterward like a stone I couldn't put down. The domestic piece of it undid me more than any grand gesture could have. Learning that she took her tea black except on nights Milo had been bad, when she wanted it the way I made it, milky and too sweet. Learning that she signed $100 million of shipping contracts before breakfast, and then knelt on a nursery rug for 40 minutes, trying to get a 10-month-old to stack 2 blocks, failing, laughing at herself for failing, in a way the newspapers would never have printed a photograph of and believed. One evening, reaching past me for a bottle warming on the counter, her hand closed briefly over mine on the handle, and neither of us moved to let go. The kitchen was very quiet. Both babies were improbably asleep. "Tell me to stop," she said, low, and I will. "I'm not telling you to stop," I said, and meant it with everything 3 years of exile had taught me to be careful with. She kissed me like she was asking a question she already half knew the answer to. Slow, and I answered it the same way. And for 1 full minute the house, the petition, Delphine's card still sitting unanswered on the desk, all of it fell away, and there was only warm chamomile and cold gunmetal, and the particular hush of 2 people finally exhaling. It was the sound of a car in the drive, too early for deliveries, that ended it. The papers came 3 days after that kiss, hand-delivered by a process server who wouldn't meet my eyes, and by the following morning half the city knew Delphine Ashcroft's version of events before Calla had finished reading her own summons. "Unfit and unstable household," the filing said, citing a chronically distressed infant, a company in the hands of a grieving widow, too consumed by business to notice her son's decline. And this was the part that made my stomach drop through the floor: the introduction into that household of an unvetted domestic employee. An unmated Omega with an illegitimate child and a history of professional misconduct at St. Callum's, whose presence in the nursery represented, in the filing's careful legal language, an additional and troubling instability. They had my name. They had the hospital scandal, twisted just enough to sound like guilt instead of exile. They had a photograph, grainy, taken through a hedge, of Calla and me in the kitchen doorway the night of the kiss. "She's been having us watched," Calla said, staring at the photograph like it had teeth. Her voice had gone somewhere cold I hadn't heard since the first night I met her. For weeks. Maybe since the day you found that bottle. Then she knows we know, I said. About the wormwood. That's why she's moving now. She's not just coming for custody of Milo anymore. Calla set the filing down with the exaggerated care of someone controlling the urge to tear it in half. She's coming for you. Discredit the nurse who found the poison, and the poison stops being evidence. It becomes gossip. A stray making trouble in a grieving woman's house. I should have felt afraid for myself. Mostly what I felt, standing in that kitchen with a headline forming somewhere in a newsroom that would print my worst year like it was the whole of me, was afraid for Poppy, who had a life ahead of her that this filing could shrink down to the size of her mother's mistakes before she'd learned to say a full sentence. I have to send you both back downstairs, Calla said, and the words came out of her like something physically extracted. Not permanently, just until the hearing. If Delphine can point to us living as a household, sharing a bed, sharing a kitchen, she'll use it to say I let personal want override my son's safety. I can't hand her that. So the plan is to hide me. The plan is to protect you. Her jaw was iron. Both of you. I've been protected out of rooms before, Calla. It never once felt like protection from where I was standing. I heard my own voice crack and hated it. It felt like being asked to disappear quietly so someone else's story could stay clean. She didn't have an answer for that, not one she was willing to say out loud, and I took Poppy back down to the maid's quarters over the garage that same night and packed the few things we'd unpacked 11 weeks before, and told myself I had known all along that houses like this one only ever borrowed people like me. I found the second bottle on the 8th night of exile in a place I had no business looking because Junie, the upstairs maid, who had never liked me, came to my door at midnight with her coat still on and her hands shaking. I need you to know I didn't understand what it was for, she said, before I'd even gotten the door fully open. She said it was a mild sedative. For the crying, she paid better than the house does, and I needed the money, and I didn't ask enough questions, and now there's a dead baby's mother's sister filing papers using a poisoning I helped cause, and I can't. She stopped, breathing hard. I kept a bottle back. In case. I don't know why. Take it. I'll say whatever you need me to say. The bottle in her hand was a twin to the one I'd found in the pantry, wormwood glycoside, a lot number this time, and a name on the supplier's invoice tucked behind the label that traced. 3 phone calls later, straight back to a private account belonging to Delphine Ashcroft. I drove to St. Callum's before dawn, badge or no badge, and found the one person in that hospital who had never stopped believing me. Dr. Okafor, who'd run my old unit and quietly, illegally, still owed me a favor from a night I'd covered his shift during his daughter's surgery. He ran the compound against Milo's original blood panel himself, off the books, and signed his name to it anyway. This is enough, he told me, sliding the results across his desk at 6 a.m. This is more than enough, Ren. I called Calla from the hospital parking lot with my hands finally steady for the first time in 8 days. I have it, I said. All of it. The bottle, the invoice, Okafor's report. It's her, Calla. It was always her. There was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. Come home, Calla said finally, and her voice broke on the word in a way I had never once heard it break. Please, both of you, come home. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, in a courtroom with pale wood paneling and a gallery already half full of press by 9:40, and Delphine Ashcroft walked in wearing black like a woman rehearsing a widowhood that had never actually been hers. I sat 2 rows behind Calla with Poppy asleep against my shoulder, the wormwood bottle and Okafor's report in a folder on my lap, and watched Delphine's lawyer stand and paint a picture of Calla Vontason so cold and distracted that a decent judge would have believed it on sight if the story had been allowed to stand alone. Your Honor, Calla's counsel said, when the moment came, we'd like to call an additional witness. I walked to the stand with my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and Delphine watched me cross the courtroom with an expression that only cracked, just slightly, when I set the folder down and opened it. Tell the court what you found in the Vantason nursery pantry on the 14th of last month, her lawyer said. I told them about the dropper bottle with no prescribing physician, about the seizure at 2:47 in the morning, about the lab panel that took a mother's guilt and turned it into a diagnosis, about a maid named Junie who'd been paid in cash by an account with Delphine Ashcroft's name on it to administer a compound that has no legitimate use in an infant under 2 years old. I laid Okafor's signed report on the exhibit table like a hand of cards nobody could argue with. The gallery, which had come expecting a story about a grieving widow's dereliction, went very still, then very loud, in the particular way a room goes when it realizes it has been watching the wrong villain the entire time. You did this, Calla said afterward, in the hallway, not to the judge, not to the reporters shouting through the courtroom doors, but to Delphine directly, her voice low and absolutely without mercy. You poisoned my son to take him from me. I did what I had to, Delphine said, and for one unguarded second the poise cracked all the way through, showing something raw and furious underneath. Iris would still be running that company if you hadn't convinced her to slow down and have a child with you. I watched her die for a family that was never going to be enough to save her, and then I watched you get to keep the one thing she died for while I got nothing. Nothing, Calla, not even grief anyone let me have out loud. For a moment, watching Calla's hands curl into fists at her sides, I thought she might do something that couldn't be undone in front of a hallway full of cameras. She's already lost everything that mattered to her, I said quietly, my hand on Calla's arm. Let the law take the rest. Don't give her a version of you she can use to say she was right. Calla's fists opened. Slowly, she looked at Delphine one last time, and there was something almost like pity in it, buried under 10 months of fury. Take her out of my sight, she said to the officers waiting at the courtroom door, and turned away before Delphine had finished being let out, toward me, toward Poppy stirring awake against my shoulder, and reached for both of us like she was done. Finally, letting anyone tell her she wasn't allowed to want something this much. The bond happened that night, in a nursery gone quiet with relief, both children finally sleeping through an entire hour without incident, for what I think was the first time in either of their lives. Tell me to stop, Calla said again, her mouth at the curve of my neck, her hands framing my face like something she still couldn't quite believe was staying. Ask me properly first, I said, half a laugh in it, because, after everything, I wanted the whole sentence, not just its shadow. Wren Calloway, she said, drawing back to look at me, her eyes gone dark and open in a way I had never seen them in public, and would come to learn was only ever mine. Will you let me claim you? Not because of the hearing, not because of Milo, not because a courtroom full of strangers finally said your name without flinching, because I have not stopped thinking of you as mine since the first night you carried a screaming child up my staircase without permission. Yes, I said, and there was nothing careful left in either of us by the time her teeth found the curve of my shoulder. Nothing but a warmth that flooded the whole room, chamomile gone gold, gunmetal gone warm. both scents braiding into something new that neither of us had worn alone before that night. The wedding happened on the lawn behind Harrow House in early autumn. Small, no press allowed past the gate. Mr. Price, standing in for the father Calla no longer had, and Edna Doyle crying openly into a handkerchief she pretended, unconvincingly, was for the wind. "In 11 years in this house," Price said, raising his glass at the small reception after, looking at Calla with Milo on one hip and Poppy's small hand fisted in the hem of her jacket, "I have never once seen her sit still long enough to hold anyone. She has not put either of these children down in 3 days. I did not think I would live to see the widow of Harrow Point become someone's whole soft center, and I am gladder of it than I have words for." "I was never a widow to her," Calla said quietly, looking at me across the small circle of chairs. "Not once. Not from the first morning she made me shepherd's pie out of a recipe I'd never told her. A year on, the house had a different sound to it, not silence, never silence, but the ordinary chaos of 2 toddlers who had decided, somewhere along the way, that they were siblings, and no one was permitted to argue otherwise. Milo had 2 full years, and a vocabulary heavy on the word mine, applied indiscriminately to toys, to Poppy, to Calla's reading glasses. Delphine Ashcroft was serving 4 years for endangerment and fraud in a facility 2 states away, her name stripped from every document that had once carried it, her trust quietly reassigned to a charitable fund for children's medical research that Calla had insisted on naming after no one but the cause itself. The wormwood star mobile above the shared nursery, we had, in the end, moved both cribs into one bright room with a bay window that caught the morning light, turned overhead in the autumn air, complete now, every wooden star strung and swaying, the missing one replaced with a new star I had carved myself, badly, over 4 winter evenings, sanded smooth by Calla's hands after mine gave out. "You finished it," Calla had said, the night I hung it, staring up at the little constellation with an expression I didn't have a word for yet. "We finished it," I said. "Some things aren't meant to be finished alone." She kissed me under it, slow, unhurried, the particular kind of kiss 2 people share when they've stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. And outside the window, the morning light came up gold over the lawn, where a wedding had happened, and where, most evenings now, 2 small children ran in uneven circles, while their mothers watched from the porch with tea gone milky and too sweet. On purpose, the way one of them liked it best. The clinic broke ground that spring, a modest building near the harbor, with a sign that read simply "Quiet Cry" for the ones no one else could explain, funded quietly, run by a woman who had once been told her competence didn't matter because of who she loved, and who she'd loved without permission first. I used to think being invisible was a kind of safety, the price you paid for not being punished twice for the same unlucky start. I know better now. The world does not reward the loudest cry. It rewards the ones patient enough to keep listening until someone finally hears it, and brave enough to crawl the whole distance themselves if no one comes. Even the quietest cry gets heard eventually. Ours did. So will yours if you keep reaching long enough toward whoever is worth the reach. The end.